Meaning is not something the human being peacefully inherits. It is something he is forced to confront when the ground beneath his certainty collapses. Philosophy does not begin in comfort, it begins in crisis. When the mind realizes that the old answers no longer hold, when the inherited beliefs fracture, when the question of freedom suddenly becomes dangerous rather than poetic, a deeper inquiry is born. Before psychology became a discipline, and before modern science tried to reduce human thought to mechanisms, certain thinkers had already sensed a darker tension inside the human condition. Among them stood William James, a mind that looked directly into the possibility that life might have no guaranteed meaning at all. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Long before the language of modern neuroscience existed, James was already confronting a terrifying possibility. What if the universe is completely determined? What if every thought, every choice, every hope is only the inevitable result of blind forces? Such a vision strips the human being of dignity. If everything is predetermined, then freedom is an illusion, and responsibility becomes meaningless. But James refused to surrender to that conclusion. Instead, he made a radical move that would shape an entire philosophical tradition. He chose to live as if freedom were real. This decision was not naive optimism. It was an existential wager. James argued that some truths do not wait for proof. They become true only when we dare to act upon them. And from that single decision unfolds a deeper investigation into the mind itself. Because to understand why belief matters, we must first confront the structure of consciousness, the hidden movement of thought, and the fragile architecture of the self. That journey begins with a crisis, and it begins with a young thinker standing face to face with the terrifying idea that the human will might not exist at all. Meaning does not collapse because the world is cruel. Meaning collapses when the human mind begins to suspect that freedom itself might be an illusion. This suspicion is not abstract. It is not a philosophical game played in quiet libraries. It is a psychological earthquake. When a person begins to believe that every thought, every desire, every decision is merely the mechanical result of prior causes, something inside the soul begins to fracture. Responsibility weakens. Hope thins. The future starts to feel pre-written. And long before modern neuroscience, long before algorithms began predicting behavior, one thinker stood directly inside this storm. In the late 19th century, when scientific determinism was gaining enormous authority, a young intellectual named William James confronted a terrifying possibility. The new scientific worldview suggested that the universe might operate like a perfect machine. Every event determined by prior events, every thought caused by previous brain states, every human action simply the inevitable unfolding of physical laws. If that vision were true, freedom would be nothing more than a comforting myth. And James did not encounter this idea as a distant academic puzzle. He encountered it as a personal crisis. The crisis began quietly, a growing intellectual pressure, a relentless question. If every event in the universe is determined, then every choice I make was already fixed before I was born. If that is true, then my sense of agency is merely an illusion produced by a chain of physical causes. This realization does something violent to the human mind. Because the self depends on the belief that it can act. Strip that belief away, and a person begins to feel like an object inside the universe rather than a participant within it. James described periods of profound psychological paralysis. The world around him seemed drained of vitality. Action felt meaningless because every action appeared predetermined. Even moral effort lost its force. Why struggle to become better if the outcome has already been decided by forces beyond your control? This is the hidden terror inside determinism. Not its logic, but its emotional consequence. A fully determined universe leaves no room for genuine responsibility. And without responsibility, meaning begins to evaporate. Many people imagine that philosophical debates about freedom are abstract. They are not. They cut directly into the deepest structures of human motivation. If a person truly believes that every choice is already determined, effort becomes theatrical. Courage becomes cosmetic. Regret becomes pointless. The entire drama of human life collapses into mechanical repetition. James saw this clearly, and he refused to accept it. But his refusal was not naive optimism. It was something far more radical. He made a decision. Not a decision based on proof, not a decision guaranteed by science, a decision of existential commitment. He decided to live as if freedom were real. This move was revolutionary because it reversed the traditional order of philosophy. Philosophers had long assumed that belief must wait for evidence. First prove a theory, then allow yourself to believe it. James saw a deeper truth. There are moments in life when waiting for proof destroys the very possibility of truth. Freedom is one of those moments, because if freedom exists, it exists only in action, only in the lived experience of choosing, only in the moment where a person says, "I will do this rather than that." But if you refuse to believe in freedom until it is scientifically proven, you may never act freely in the first place. The proof would never arrive. James recognized that the human mind sometimes faces what he later called a genuine option, a decision that cannot be postponed, a choice that must be made before certainty appears. Freedom belongs to this category. You cannot step outside life and run an experiment on your own existence. You cannot pause reality while waiting for absolute evidence. Life demands action now. And so James performed an act of philosophical courage. He chose belief. Not blind belief, not irrational belief, a pragmatic belief. A belief justified not by theoretical certainty, but by its consequences for living. If I believe that my choices matter, I act differently. I take responsibility. I struggle. I attempt to shape my future. If I believe my choices are illusions, I become passive. I drift. I surrender initiative. One belief generates vitality. The other generates paralysis. James asked a brutal question: which belief allows a human being to live? This question stripped philosophy of its traditional distance. It forced ideas to face life directly. An idea was no longer valuable merely because it was logically elegant. It had to survive contact with human existence. And determinism, when fully absorbed into the psyche, often fails that test. Because the human organism is built for agency, built for effort, built for striving toward futures that do not yet exist. Remove that orientation, and the psychological system begins to malfunction. James realized something profound about the structure of human experience. The feeling of freedom may not be provable in advance, but it is necessary for the functioning of the self. Without it, initiative collapses. And this insight cuts directly into the modern world. Today, many people quietly absorb deterministic narratives about their lives. They hear that personality is fixed by genetics, that behavior is driven by neurochemistry, that algorithms can predict decisions before individuals make them. The language has become more technical, but the underlying message is ancient. You are not truly free. And yet, despite all this knowledge, human beings continue to experience themselves as agents. They continue to deliberate. They continue to hesitate between alternatives. They continue to feel the weight of responsibility pressing on every decision. This tension reveals something fundamental. Even when the intellect flirts with determinism, the lived structure of consciousness resists it. Inside the mind, choices still feel real. And the modern individual lives in the same psychological battlefield that James once faced, surrounded by systems explaining behavior, yet still feeling the raw pressure of deciding how to live. This is not a contradiction to be solved by theory. It is a tension to be confronted by courage. Because the deepest fear hiding beneath determinism is not that the universe is mechanical. The deeper fear is that our struggles might not matter. Human beings are terrified of discovering that their efforts are meaningless motions in a predetermined script. James refused that conclusion. He did not claim to possess final metaphysical proof of freedom. Instead, he exposed the psychological stakes of disbelief. A life lived without belief in freedom slowly drains itself of urgency. Moral decisions become decorative gestures. The future becomes a corridor already built. But the moment a person chooses to believe that action matters, something inside the psyche awakens. Responsibility returns. Possibility returns. Effort regains its dignity. And this decision transforms the individual from a passive object into a participant in reality. James himself became the living symbol of this transformation. The young intellectual who once felt crushed by deterministic despair gradually rebuilt his inner life around the conviction that belief can shape experience. His philosophy did not emerge from detached speculation. It emerged from survival. Through his struggle, we see something uncomfortable about the human condition. We want certainty before commitment. We want guarantees before action. We want proof before belief. But existence rarely grants such luxuries. Life confronts us with decisions that must be made in the dark. Love is chosen before it is proven permanent. Courage is exercised before the outcome is known. Faith in one's own agency appears before any scientific confirmation. The will moves first. Evidence follows later. And this is why James believed that belief itself, can open doors in reality that skepticism alone would leave permanently closed. A person who refuses to act until certainty appears may spend an entire life waiting. Meanwhile, the individual who acts under the assumption of freedom creates experiences that gradually confirm the power of choice. This does not mean freedom is guaranteed. It means freedom becomes possible only when it is exercised. James forced philosophy to confront this unsettling truth. Ideas do not float above life. They shape the psychological environment in which life unfolds. Believe that your actions matter, and you enter the world as a creator of consequences. Believe that everything is predetermined, and you quietly step aside while the machinery of existence runs without you. The difference between these two attitudes is not merely intellectual, it is existential. It determines whether a person experiences life as a field of possibility or a prison of inevitability. Yet the story does not end here, because once James chose to live as if freedom were real, another question emerged immediately. If freedom exists inside human experience, how exactly does the mind operate when it makes a choice? What is consciousness actually like from the inside? Is the mind a collection of separate mental pieces, as many psychologists once believed? Or is it something far more fluid and continuous? As James turned his attention inward, examining the texture of thought itself, he began to uncover a radical insight that would transform psychology. The mind, he discovered, does not move in fragments. It flows. Thought does not arrive in fragments. Thought moves like a current. The mind is not a box filled with separate ideas waiting to be arranged. It is movement. It is transition. It is a living flow in which one moment dissolves into the next before we even notice the boundary. This realization cuts against centuries of psychological assumptions. For a long time, many thinkers believed the mind worked like a machine made of small mental pieces. Ideas were imagined as individual units, tiny atoms of thought that combine to form complex experiences. According to this view, consciousness could be broken apart and analyzed the same way a chemist analyzes matter. But William James saw something that shattered this mechanical picture. When we look directly into our own experience, we never encounter isolated thoughts. We encounter continuity. Before modern psychology fully emerged as a scientific discipline, James confronted a fundamental question. What is consciousness actually like from the inside? Not in theory, not in laboratory diagrams, but in the raw texture of lived experience. And when he examined his own mind with ruthless honesty, he discovered something simple yet revolutionary. Consciousness flows. A thought never appears alone. It carries traces of what came before and hints of what will follow. Each mental moment leans into the next. Each perception drags behind it a shadow of memory and expectation. The mind does not jump from one static point to another. It moves like water. James called this phenomenon the stream of consciousness. The metaphor was not poetic decoration. It was an attempt to expose the true structure of the mind. A stream cannot be divided into perfectly separate drops while it flows. The moment you attempt to isolate a portion, the movement has already carried it forward. Human awareness behaves in exactly this way. Consider something simple, a melody. When you hear a sequence of notes, you do not experience each note as an isolated sound. The previous note lingers faintly in memory, while the next note emerges. The meaning of the melody exists not in individual tones, but in the continuity between them. Remove the flow, and the music collapses into noise. The same structure governs thought itself. When you read a sentence, each word carries meaning because it is connected to the words before and after it. When you remember your childhood, the images do not appear as detached snapshots. They emerge within a wider atmosphere of emotion, association, and time. The mind is never static. It is always becoming. This insight attacked the dominant psychological model of the 19th century, which treated thoughts like mental atoms. According to that model, the mind was a container filled with separate sensations and ideas that combined mechanically. James saw the flaw immediately. No one actually experiences the mind that way. We experience transitions, not fragments. We experience the movement between thoughts more vividly than the thoughts themselves. The mind glides. And this simple observation carried enormous consequences. Because if consciousness is a continuous flow, then human experience cannot be reduced to isolated components. The meaning of any thought depends on its position within the wider current of awareness. A single idea removed from its context becomes almost meaningless. James understood that the mind constantly blends past, present, and anticipation into a single living process. The present moment is never a razor-thin slice of time. It carries echoes of what just happened and anticipations of what might happen next. In other words, the present has depth. It has duration. This challenges one of the most powerful illusions of human thinking. We often imagine time as a sequence of perfectly separate moments, like frames in a film. But lived experience refuses this neat separation. Each moment bleeds into the next. Consciousness refuses to stand still long enough to be dissected. James recognized that psychology must begin from this fluidity rather than from artificial divisions. If we attempt to freeze the mind into static pieces, we distort the phenomenon we are trying to understand. The stream continues moving, whether theory approves or not. And once this flowing nature of consciousness is acknowledged, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Identity itself becomes fluid. Because if thought is continuous movement, then the self is not a fixed object hidden inside the mind. The self is the ongoing process of that movement. The person you are in this moment carries traces of the person you were a moment ago. Yet you are already becoming someone slightly different. Each thought modifies the stream. Each experience bends the direction of consciousness. This does not mean the self disappears. It means the self lives through continuity rather than through permanence. James revealed something deeply unsettling. We are not solid psychological structures. We are patterns within a flowing process. This realization unsettles people because humans crave stability. We want to believe there is a permanent core inside us that never changes, a stable identity immune to time. But the mind refuses such simplicity. Look carefully at your own awareness. The emotions shift, the focus drifts, memories rise and fall, desires evolve. The sense of self subtly reorganizes itself as experience accumulates. Yet despite this constant change, a mysterious continuity remains. You still feel like the same person who woke up this morning, the same person who remembers childhood, the same person who imagines tomorrow. How can identity survive such constant movement? James believed the answer lies in the continuity of the stream itself. The self persists not because it is fixed, but because each moment of consciousness inherits the direction of the previous one. The stream carries its own history forward. This continuity allows the mind to recognize itself across time. Without it, experience will collapse into chaos. Imagine waking up each second with no connection to the moment before. Every perception would feel alien. Every thought would appear without context. There would be no narrative linking the fragments. The self would vanish instantly. The fact that we experience a coherent life proves that the stream of consciousness binds moments together into an unfolding story. And this story is not merely intellectual, it is existential. Because within that flowing stream, decisions occur, intentions arise, attention shifts, meaning forms. Freedom itself operates inside this current. A rigid mechanical mind made of separate parts would leave little room for genuine spontaneity. But a flowing mind creates space for subtle variations. Each moment carries possibilities that were not strictly predetermined by the last. The stream allows movement. Movement allows choice. This insight quietly reinforced the decision James had made during his earlier crisis. If the mind were truly a mechanical assembly of mental atoms, determinism might dominate every psychological process. But the fluid structure of consciousness suggests something more open. Experience unfolds dynamically rather than mechanically. And yet, the flowing nature of thought introduces another challenge. If consciousness is always moving, always blending moments together, how do we ever manage to focus on anything clearly? How do we recognize objects, form ideas, or maintain stable meanings inside such a fluid mental environment? This question reveals another hidden layer within the stream. Not every part of consciousness is equally clear. Some thoughts stand sharply at the center of awareness. Others remain vague, almost invisible, hovering at the edge of perception. We feel their presence without fully grasping them. A word rests on the tip of the tongue. A memory floats just beyond reach. A vague sense of familiarity accompanies a place we have visited before. These subtle mental shadows play a far greater role in thinking than we usually admit. James noticed them, and once he began to examine these barely visible edges of consciousness, he realized something astonishing. The most important meanings in our lives often emerge not from the clear center of thought, but from these quiet margins where feeling, memory, and association begin to gather before becoming fully formed ideas. The stream of consciousness does not move evenly. It has currents, depths, and hidden undercurrents that shape the direction of thought long before we notice them. The mind does not think only at the center. The mind thinks at the edges. What we call a clear idea is only the visible crest of a much larger psychological movement. Beneath every sharp thought lies a wide field of half-formed tendencies, silent associations, vague recognitions, and subtle feelings that shape the direction of consciousness long before the intellect notices them. Human beings believe they understand their own thinking. They do not. Most of the mind operates in regions that remain dim, indirect, and nearly invisible. William James saw this with extraordinary clarity. While many psychologists tried to dissect consciousness into neat and measurable units, James looked more carefully into the texture of experience itself. And what he discovered was unsettling. The center of thought is only a small island. Around it stretches an immense and shifting horizon. In ordinary life, we imagine that thinking consists of clear ideas arranged one after another. We picture the mind as if it were a sequence of distinct mental images. A concept appears, then disappears, replaced by the next. But this picture is deeply misleading. Between clear thoughts lie transitions. Around every idea exists a penumbra of related impressions. Feelings of familiarity, expectation, hesitation, recognition, and association hover around the center of awareness like a quiet atmosphere. James called this region the fringe of consciousness. And this fringe is not a minor feature of thought. It is the place where meaning actually begins to form. Consider a simple experience. You walk into a room and instantly feel that something is wrong. Nothing obvious has changed. The furniture is the same. The light is the same. Yet a quiet unease emerges. Your mind has detected a difference before it can articulate it. Moments later, you realize that a painting has been moved slightly to the left. The recognition did not begin with the clear idea. It began in the fringe. A subtle disturbance in the background of awareness signaled that something was out of place. The clear thought arrived only after the vague sensation had already started guiding attention. This is how thinking often works. Meaning emerges gradually from the margins of consciousness before it becomes explicit in the center. The mind is constantly registering patterns and relationships that remain only partially visible. These faint signals shape interpretation, expectation, and understanding long before the intellect organizes them into words. James realized that psychology had ignored this entire dimension of experience. Earlier theories treated ideas as isolated mental objects. Each thought was assumed to have a clear and definable boundary. Meaning was believed to reside entirely inside these central ideas. But when James looked at the actual structure of consciousness, he saw something very different. Ideas are never alone. Each thought carries a surrounding field of associations that silently influence its significance. A word, for example, does not merely represent a dictionary definition. It carries a history of experiences, emotions, context, and memories that suddenly color its meaning. When a person hears the word home, the meaning does not arise solely from the letters or the concept. It arises from the entire atmosphere surrounding the word inside the mind. For one person, the word evokes warmth and safety. For another, it triggers tension or longing. The central idea remains the same, but the fringe transforms its emotional and psychological impact. Meaning, therefore, cannot be reduced to isolated images. Meaning is contextual. It grows out of relationships between thoughts, memories, and sensations that often remain just outside the focus of awareness. This insight shattered the simplistic models of thinking that dominated early psychology. Human thought is not a sequence of clean logical units. It is a layered process in which clarity emerges from ambiguity. The fringe prepares the ground. The center simply declares what the fringe has already begun. And this dynamic explains many strange features of the mind that people experience but rarely understand. Why does a solution to a problem sometimes appear suddenly after hours of confusion? Why does a forgotten name linger just beyond recall until it abruptly surfaces? Why do certain decisions feel correct even before we can explain them. The answer lies in the hidden activity of the fringe. While the center of consciousness struggles with explicit reasoning, the margins quietly reorganize associations and memories. They test possibilities without fully presenting them to awareness. Gradually, the correct configuration forms beneath the surface. Then, at a certain moment, the result rises into the center as a clear insight. The mind announces the conclusion, but the real work occurred earlier in the shadows. This phenomenon reveals a deeper truth about human cognition. We are not the absolute authors of our thoughts. We are participants in a process that unfolds partly beyond our conscious control. The fringe continuously feeds the center with hints, feelings, and directional signals. These signals guide attention, suggest interpretations, and influence judgment. Often, we mistake the final clear idea for the beginning of the thinking process. In reality, it is the end. James recognized that understanding the fringe is essential for understanding how meaning is constructed. The mind does not perceive isolated facts. It perceives relationships. A face in a crowd is not recognized simply by its physical features. It is recognized because a network of associations suddenly activates. Familiarity spreads across the fringe of consciousness before the person's name reaches the center of thought. Recognition begins as a feeling. Only later does it become a statement. This structure also explains why human communication is far more complex than exchanging words. Two individuals may hear the same sentence, yet interpret it in radically different ways. The central words remain identical, but the fringe surrounding those words differs from mind to mind. Personal history modifies meaning. Emotional memory reshapes interpretation. Subtle associations tilt understanding in directions that neither speaker nor listener fully realizes. Language operates inside the visible center of thought. Meaning lives in the invisible margins. James understood that ignoring this fringe produces a distorted image of the mind. A psychology that studies only clear ideas misses the deeper currents shaping human experience. But the implications reach even further. The fringe is also the birthplace of creativity. When new ideas emerge, they rarely appear as fully formed logical structures. They begin as vague intuitions, a faint sense that something might be possible, a direction without a clear map. Artists feel this constantly. Scientists experience it during discovery. Philosophers sense it while searching for new concepts. The mind moves through ambiguity before arriving at clarity. The fringe holds possibilities that have not yet crystallized. And this is why rigid thinking suffocates creativity. When a person demands immediate precision from every thought, the subtle signals of the fringe are suppressed. The mind loses access to the slow formation of meaning. James saw that intellectual life depends on respecting this dim region of consciousness. The fringe is not confusion. It is preparation. Within it, countless associations interact, combine, and dissolve until a pattern strong enough emerges to cross into the center of awareness. But the fringe does more than create ideas. It also guides perception itself. When we look at the world, We believe we see reality directly. Yet perception is never neutral. The fringe continuously influences what the mind notices and what it ignores. Expectations shape attention. Familiarity guides recognition. Subtle emotional tones direct interpretation. The world we perceive is not simply the external environment. It is the environment filtered through the shifting margins of consciousness. This leads to a disturbing realization. Two individuals can inhabit the same physical space and yet experience entirely different realities. Not because the world itself changes, but because their fringes organize perception differently. One person notices opportunity, another notices threat. One sees beauty, another sees indifference. The difference begins long before conscious reasoning. It begins in the silent guidance of attention. And here, the stream of consciousness reveals another crucial mechanism. Out of the countless impressions surrounding us at every moment, the mind must constantly select certain elements and ignore the rest. Without such selection, experience would become overwhelming chaos. Something must decide what enters the center of awareness. Something must determine which signals rise from the fringe and which remain in the background. This power shapes the world each person lives inside. It determines what becomes meaningful and what fades into invisibility. William James realized that this power is neither passive nor automatic. It is an act of the mind itself. It is attention. Attention is the invisible hand that builds the world. Reality does not arrive fully formed before the human mind. The universe presents an overwhelming flood of impressions, signals, movements, sounds, possibilities. Yet the human mind cannot hold all of them at once. Consciousness would collapse under the weight of such abundance. Something must choose. Something must cut through the chaos and say, this matters and that does not. That power is attention. William James understood that attention is not a minor function of the mind. It is the architect of experience itself. The world each person believes they inhabit is largely the result of what their attention has decided to select from the endless field of available stimuli. Most people assume they see reality as it is. James would say they see only what their attention allows. Long before the digital age filled human life with competing signals, James recognized that consciousness survives only through radical selection. At any moment, thousands of impressions press against the senses: the sound of distant traffic, the pressure of clothing against the skin, the subtle shift of light in a room, the movement of breath in the chest, memories drifting through thought, expectations about what might happen next. Yet the mind highlights only a few of these elements. Everything else fades into the background. Attention functions like a spotlight inside the vast theater of consciousness. Wherever it turns, clarity appears. Whatever remains outside its beam dissolves into obscurity. And this simple mechanism carries enormous philosophical consequences. Because the spotlight can move. Two individuals may stand in the same place, surrounded by the same environment, yet their worlds will differ dramatically depending on where their attention settles. One person notices opportunity, another notices risk. One sees beauty in small details, another sees only irritation and noise. The external world remains constant. The experience world changes completely. James argued that attention is not merely passive reception. It is active selection. The mind constantly decides where to invest its limited energy. Every act of attention strengthens certain elements of experience while weakening others. What we attend to grows in psychological weight. What we ignore gradually disappears. This process shapes identity more deeply than people realize. Consider how a person forms a sense of who they are. That identity is not constructed from every event in life. It emerges from the events attention chooses to emphasize. A single criticism may dominate memory, while dozens of compliments fade into silence. A moment of failure may receive relentless focus, while long periods of competence remain unnoticed. Attention sculpts self-perception. James understood that the mind cannot escape this filtering process. Selection is unavoidable. Consciousness must choose. But this necessity introduces a powerful question. Who controls attention? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. We believe we direct our own focus. We decide what to observe and what to ignore. Yet this confidence begins to crack when we examine the actual behavior of the mind. Attention drifts. A person opens a book intending to read for an hour. Within minutes, the mind wanders into memories, worries, random associations. The words on the page dissolve while internal thoughts steal the spotlight. The individual did not consciously choose this shift. Attention simply moved. This reveals a deeper structure within consciousness. Part of attention responds automatically to novelty, emotion, and habit. Loud noises seize awareness instantly. Sudden movement captures the eye. A remembered fear pulls attention into anxious prediction. The mind is constantly being pulled by forces beneath deliberate control. Yet James insisted that another dimension of attention exists: voluntary attention. This is the effortful act of directing the mind despite distraction. It is the moment when a person deliberately returns to the page they are reading. The moment when a scientist continues analyzing data despite fatigue. The moment when an individual chooses to focus on a meaningful goal rather than surrender to immediate impulses. This effort may appear small, but James saw it as the core of mental life. Voluntary attention is the mechanism through which human beings exercise agency within the flow of consciousness. Without it, the mind becomes a drifting object carried entirely by external stimuli and internal habits. With it, a person gains the ability to shape their psychological environment. Attention determines which thoughts develop strength. Thoughts that receive repeated focus gradually dominate the stream of consciousness. They influence emotion, interpretation, and behavior. Thoughts that receive no attention fade before they can shape the mind. In this sense, attention is the gatekeeper of the inner world. James recognized something crucial here. Character is built through patterns of attention. A person who repeatedly directs attention toward resentment slowly constructs a personality organized around grievance. A person who repeatedly focuses on possibility begins to organize thought around opportunity. A person who trains attention toward discipline gradually develops the ability to resist distraction. The mind becomes what it repeatedly observes. This insight carries enormous implications for the modern age. Today, the competition for human attention has reached unprecedented intensity. Screens flash, notifications demand response. Endless streams of information compete for the limited spotlight of consciousness. The environment constantly attempts to hijack attention. And when attention is captured by external forces, the internal architecture of the mind begins to change. Focus weakens, patience erodes, Deep thought becomes difficult because the spotlight rarely remains steady long enough for complex ideas to form. James predicted this danger long before the technological world made it visible. He argued that the ability to sustain attention is the foundation of intellectual development and moral strength. Without sustained attention, the mind cannot organize itself around meaningful purposes. It becomes reactive rather than deliberate. The stream of consciousness loses direction. James described attention as the taking possession by the mind of one out of several possible objects or trains of thought. This act may seem simple, yet it requires energy. Every moment of focus represents a small victory over distraction, and those small victories accumulate. A life shaped by intentional attention gradually acquires coherence. Goals become clearer. Values stabilize. Decisions aligned with long-term meaning rather than short-term impulses. But when attention is scattered endlessly across trivial stimuli, the mind begins to fragment. Identity weakens because no single direction receives sustained energy. This is not merely a cognitive issue. It is existential, because meaning itself depends on attention. A moment becomes meaningful when consciousness dwells upon it deeply enough to recognize its significance. Relationships deepen when attention lingers on another person rather than drifting away. Ideas grow powerful when attention returns to them repeatedly, examining them from multiple angles. Without attention, experience becomes shallow. Life passes through the mind without leaving structure. James believed that training attention is therefore one of the highest forms of self-discipline, not through repression, but through deliberate redirection. Each time the mind wanders and returns, it strengthens the capacity for sustained awareness. Over time, this practice transforms the entire psychological landscape. The individual gains increasing influence over the direction of thought, and with that influence comes a deeper question. If attention can shape experience so profoundly, then what exactly is the self that directs this attention? Who is the observer standing behind the spotlight of consciousness? Is the self a single, unified entity guiding the mind? Or is it something far more complex, layered, and unstable than we usually imagine? When James turned his investigation toward this question, he uncovered another unsettling discovery. The self, like consciousness itself, is not one thing. It is many. The self is not a single solid entity. The self is a layered construction constantly negotiating with itself. Human beings love the idea of unity. We want to believe there is a single, stable identity inside us, a permanent center that defines who we are. We say I as if the word points to something simple, indivisible, and fixed. William James shattered that illusion. When he examined the structure of personal identity, he discovered that the self is not one voice speaking through consciousness. It is a complex arrangement of multiple selves operating simultaneously, each pulling attention, desire, and behavior in different directions. The human being is not a single character. The human being is a psychological society. James approached the problem directly. When a person says I, what exactly does that word refer to? Does it point to the body, to the personality, to memory, to social identity, to some deeper inner observer? The answer, James realized, is all of these at once. The self contains several distinct layers, each with its own structure and influence. These layers overlap, compete, and cooperate, creating the dynamic complexity that we experience as personal identity. The first layer is the material self. This is the most visible form of identity. It includes the body, possessions, and physical environments that a person associates with their existence. Clothes, home, tools, and objects become extensions of the self because they participate in the narrative of personal life. This may sound trivial, but the psychological attachment to the material self is powerful. People defend their belongings with emotional intensity because these objects represent continuity and control. Losing them can feel like losing part of one's own identity. The body itself occupies the center of this material self. Pain in the body is not experienced as an external event. It is felt as something happening to me. The body anchors identity in the physical world. It provides boundaries between the individual and the environment. Yet, the material self alone cannot explain who we are. Another layer emerges the moment we encounter other people. James called this the social self. Every human being carries multiple social identities because every relationship reflects a slightly different version of the self. The way a person behaves with family is rarely identical to the way they behave with colleagues. The voice used with close friends differs from the voice used with strangers. Each social context activates a different configuration of identity. In a sense, every person who knows us holds a separate version of who we are. And we respond to those expectations. This means the self is partly constructed through recognition. Identity becomes real when it is reflected back by others. Approval strengthens certain aspects of the personality. Rejection suppresses others. A person may feel confident among supportive companions, yet insecure in an unfamiliar group. The internal experience of self shifts because the social mirror changes. James understood that this multiplicity does not mean the self is false. It means identity is relational. Human beings exist inside networks of perception and response. The self evolves through these interactions. Without other minds to recognize and respond to us, large parts of identity would remain undeveloped. But beyond the material and social selves lies another layer that James considered even more important: the spiritual self. This is not a religious label. It refers to the inner core of consciousness where thought, intention, values, and reflection occur. It includes beliefs, moral commitments, aspirations, and the sense of personal agency. If the material self anchors identity in the physical world, and the social self anchors identity in relationships, the spiritual self anchors identity in inward awareness. Here, the individual confronts questions of meaning, responsibility, and purpose. This is the region where the will operates. And this layer introduces tension within the structure of the self, because the different selves do not always agree. The material self seeks comfort and security. The social self seeks approval and belonging. The spiritual self seeks coherence with values and ideals. These motives often collide. A person may desire financial success while simultaneously fearing social judgment. Another may crave recognition while privately feeling the need for solitude. One part of the self pushes toward ambition, while another part longs for peace. Identity becomes a negotiation between competing centers of motivation. James recognized that much of human conflict arises from this internal plurality. We do not suffer only from external obstacles. We suffer because different parts of the self demand incompatible futures. The mind becomes a battlefield of priorities. One voice insists on discipline. Another whispers the desire for comfort. One identity wants admiration. Another seeks authenticity. One self pursues status. Another yearns for meaning. And attention becomes the judge that decides which voice gains influence. Whichever aspect of the self receives sustained attention gradually strengthens. The neglected aspects fade into silence. In this way, identity evolves. James believed the self is not a finished structure, but an ongoing process of selection. At every moment, the individual chooses, consciously or unconsciously, which version of the self to reinforce. This explains why life often feels like a series of internal negotiations. A student struggles between the immediate pleasure of distraction and the long-term identity of intellectual achievement. A professional struggles between ambition and integrity. A parent struggles between personal desires and responsibilities toward family. Each decision subtly reshapes the hierarchy of the self. Over time, patterns emerge. The repeated triumph of certain motives forms character. James saw character not as a mysterious essence, but as the stable result of repeated choices among competing selves. The individual gradually builds a dominant identity by consistently favoring certain values over others. But this process also creates vulnerability. Because identity depends on recognition, comparison becomes unavoidable. James describes self-esteem as the relationship between our aspirations and our achievements. When aspirations rise beyond what we can realistically accomplish, dissatisfaction grows. When achievements align with personal ideals, confidence strengthens. This equation reveals something brutal about the psychology of identity. Human beings often suffer not because they lack ability, but because they measure themselves against impossible standards. The social world constantly offers models of success, beauty, intelligence, influence. Each model becomes a possible version of the self. The mind begins comparing its current identity to these imagined alternatives. The result is internal tension. A person may live comfortably yet feel inadequate because another version of the self seems more impressive. Another person may achieve extraordinary success yet still feel incomplete because their spiritual self demands deeper meaning. The modern world intensifies this problem. In the age surrounding 2025, individuals encounter endless representations of other lives. Images of achievement, beauty, influence, and wealth circulate constantly. Each image introduces another possible self against which the current self can be measured. Comparison multiplies identity. And with each comparison, dissatisfaction finds new territory. James believed the only stable solution lies in conscious limitation. A person must decide which identities truly matter and abandon the rest. Without this discipline, the self becomes fragmented, chasing approval in every direction without achieving coherence. This decision requires courage because it means accepting the loss of countless possible selves. Every path chosen excludes other identities that might have been pursued. But without exclusion, there can be no unity. The individual who attempts to satisfy every version of the self eventually loses the ability to commit to any of them. James therefore placed enormous importance on the development of a central organizing purpose. Not a rigid ideology, but a guiding direction capable of aligning the different layers of identity. When such a direction exists, the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self begin to cooperate rather than compete. The body becomes a tool for action. Relationships become environments for growth. Inner values become the compass guiding decisions. But even when such alignment emerges, another force quietly shapes the structure of identity from beneath the surface. Because the self is not built only through conscious decisions, it is also built through repetition. Small actions repeated day after day slowly carve deep patterns into the nervous system. These patterns influence thought, emotion, and behavior long before conscious reflection intervenes. James understood that the invisible mechanism behind these patterns is one of the most powerful forces in human life: habit. Habit is the hidden machinery of human destiny. People speak about freedom as if every decision were made in a moment of conscious choice. They imagine life as a sequence of dramatic crossroads where the individual heroically decides who they will become. Reality is far less theatrical. Most of life is governed not by great decisions, but by repeated actions so small that they escape attention. These actions accumulate quietly, shaping the nervous system, reorganizing behavior, and gradually constructing the character that later appears inevitable. William James saw this mechanism with brutal clarity. Human beings do not simply act. They become the patterns of their actions. When James examined the human brain through the scientific understanding available in his time, he noticed something extraordinary. The nervous system is not a rigid structure. It is plastic. It adapts to repeated activity. Each time a behavior is performed, the neural pathways responsible for that behavior become slightly easier to activate again. The brain learns efficiency. Energy follows familiarity. A repeated action gradually transforms from effort into automatic response. This transformation is habit. Habit is the process through which voluntary actions become involuntary tendencies. What once required concentration eventually unfolds with minimal attention. The mind no longer needs to deliberate because the pathway has already been carved. This mechanism is not merely convenient, it is necessary for survival. Imagine if every small action required full conscious effort. Walking would demand constant calculation of muscle movement. Speaking would require deliberate construction of every sound. Even simple daily routines would exhaust the mind. Habit frees consciousness from this burden. By automating repeated behaviors, the brain conserves mental energy for new problems and complex decisions. But this efficiency hides a dangerous truth. Habit does not distinguish between constructive and destructive actions. The brain strengthens whatever is repeated. If a person repeatedly practices discipline, discipline becomes easier. If a person repeatedly indulges avoidance, avoidance becomes natural. Courage, laziness, patience, resentment, curiosity, distraction, generosity, cruelty, all of them can become habits. The nervous system simply records repetition. And over time, these repetitions form the architecture of personality. James understood that habit functions like a flywheel inside human life. Once set into motion, it maintains momentum with little effort. A person who has built the habit of reading daily rarely struggles to begin. A person who has built the habit of procrastination finds it nearly impossible to start. The initial action required effort. The repeated action requires almost none. Character, therefore, is not built in rare moments of inspiration. It is built through the silent accumulation of daily behavior. This insight strips away many comforting illusions. People often blame external circumstances for the shape of their lives. They search for dramatic turning points that explain success or failure. Yet beneath those events lies a simpler and more relentless force, the pattern of habits already operating inside the individual. A person who has trained the mind toward persistence gradually becomes someone capable of enduring difficulty. A person who has trained the mind toward immediate pleasure becomes someone easily defeated by discomfort. The difference rarely appears overnight. It grows slowly through repetition. James warned that the power of habit makes early choices particularly significant. The first patterns established in youth tend to persist because they carve the initial channels through which behavior flows. Once these channels deepen, changing direction becomes far more difficult. The nervous system resists disruption. It prefers the familiar path. This is why individuals often feel trapped inside their own tendencies. They are not merely fighting isolated actions. They are confronting entire networks of habitual responses embedded within the brain. Breaking a habit requires more than good intentions. It requires the creation of a competing pattern strong enough to replace the old one. James advised brutal honesty about this process. Every action strengthens a tendency. Every refusal weakens it. The law is simple and merciless. Do something once, and the brain records the possibility. Do it repeatedly, and the brain begins to expect it. Continue long enough, and the brain assumes it is part of who you are. The habit becomes identity. Yet this law is not entirely cruel, because the same mechanism that traps people also offers liberation. The brain does not permanently distinguish between past and future habits. It simply follows repetition. This means new patterns can be built, though the effort required may initially feel overwhelming. James offered practical guidance for those who wish to reshape their lives through habit. First, begin decisively. When a new habit is chosen, it must be launched with strong and immediate action. Half-hearted attempts fail because the old pattern still holds greater momentum. A decisive break increases the chance that the new behavior will establish its own pathway. Second, never allow exceptions during the formation period. Each exception weakens the emerging habit and strengthens the previous one. Consistency during the early phase is critical because the brain is still deciding which pattern will dominate. Third, seize every opportunity to act on the new habit. Each repetition deepens the neural pathway. The brain learns through action, not through intention. Thinking about change does not change the nervous system. Only repeated behavior can do that. Finally, maintain continuous effort until the action becomes automatic. Once the habit stabilizes, the brain begins supporting the behavior rather than resisting it. James believed that societies themselves are shaped by collective habits. Institutions, traditions, and cultural norms function in ways remarkably similar to personal habits. They persist because repetition has carved deep grooves into collective behavior. This explains why social change often encounters fierce resistance. People are not merely defending ideas, they are defending patterns that have become neurologically comfortable. Habit operates on both individual and collective levels, and the modern world presents a new challenge to this ancient mechanism. The environment surrounding humans in the era approaching 2025 constantly encourages fragmented attention and impulsive behavior. Digital systems deliver rapid rewards, immediate stimulation, and endless novelty. These experiences train the brain to crave quick satisfaction. Over time, this environment can reshape the habits of attention itself. Patience weakens, deep concentration becomes rare. The nervous system grows accustomed to constant interruption. The individual may believe they are freely choosing these behaviors, yet the brain quietly adapts to the pattern of stimulation. Habit reshapes the structure of desire. James would likely argue that the defense against such forces lies in deliberate cultivation of counter habits, habits of sustained focus, habits of reflection, habits of disciplined effort that resist the pull of instant gratification. Without such training, the mind gradually loses its capacity for long-range thinking. Life becomes reactive rather than intentional. But even the strongest habits cannot fully explain the continuity of human experience across time. Because habit shapes behavior, yet another force binds the present to the past. Human beings do not merely repeat actions, they remember. Memory stretches the stream of consciousness beyond the immediate moment. It carries fragments of earlier life into present awareness, allowing the individual to experience continuity across years and decades. Without memory, habits would lose its meaning. Because the self that acts today would have no connection to the self that acted yesterday. James realized that memory does not simply store the past, it actively shapes the present moment, weaving layers of time into the living experience of identity. The past is never truly past. It breathes inside the present. Human beings speak about time as if it were a line, yesterday behind us, tomorrow ahead of us. The present moment balanced like a thin blade between the two. But the mind does not experience time this way. Consciousness carries its past within it. Every moment of awareness contains traces of what came before. The present is not a single point. It is a thick layer of experience where memory, perception, and expectation merge into a living continuity. William James saw this clearly when he turned his attention toward the structure of memory. The self persists not because the present is stable, but because the past continues to live inside it. If memory vanished completely every few seconds, personal identity would collapse. A human being would awaken into each new moment without any bridge connecting it to the previous one. The world would appear endlessly unfamiliar. No learning would accumulate. No personality would stabilize. Experience would dissolve into fragments. The fact that this does not happen reveals the silent power of memory. Memory binds the stream of consciousness together across time. It allows the mind to recognize patterns, maintain relationships, pursue goals, and construct a narrative of existence. Without memory, there would be sensation, but no life story. Yet memory is far more complex than simple storage. James understood that the mind holds the past in multiple layers. Some memories remain vivid and accessible. Others sink into distant regions of consciousness, where they continue influencing perception without clearly appearing in thought. The mind does not treat every moment equally. Certain experiences become deeply engraved because they carry emotional intensity, novelty, or repeated attention. Other events fade almost immediately because they never received enough psychological energy to become stable. This process reveals a brutal truth. What we remember is not the totality of our life. It is the portion of life that our attention once chose to preserve. Memory, therefore, depends on the same selective force that shapes perception. The mind cannot retain every detail. It must choose. Certain impressions become permanent structures, while countless others disappear into silence. Over time, this selection builds the narrative of the self. When a person recalls childhood, they do not recover an exact recording of the past. They reconstruct the story from fragments. A few vivid scenes stand out, while entire years vanish into shadow. The individual interprets these fragments, connecting them into a coherent account of who they have been. The past becomes a story told by memory, and like all stories, it contains interpretation. James believed this interpretive nature of memory reveals something unsettling about personal identity. The self we believe we remember is partly created by the way we organize our memories. Two individuals may live through similar events, yet construct radically different identities because they emphasize different aspects of their past. One person remembers moments of encouragement and develops confidence. Another remembers criticism and develops insecurity. The events may be similar. The remembered narrative diverges. Memory therefore acts not only as a record, but also as a sculptor of personality. It shapes the emotional meaning of earlier experiences and projects that meaning forward into future behavior. A person who remembers failure intensely may approach new opportunities with caution or fear. A person who remembers resilience may confront challenges with greater courage. The remembered past influences the imagined future. But James recognized that memory itself has layers of depth. Some memories remain close to the surface of consciousness. They can be recalled easily with a small effort of attention. What did you eat this morning? Who spoke to you yesterday? These events remain accessible because they still occupy recent space in the stream of thought. Other memories sink deeper. They may disappear from conscious recall for years, yet remain stored somewhere in the mind's vast archive. A smell suddenly evokes a forgotten childhood place. A melody resurrects a memory that seemed lost forever. A random phrase triggers recognition of a person not seen for decades. These moments reveal that memory does not vanish when it leaves awareness. It waits. The mind holds more of the past than we consciously remember. James distinguished between immediate memory and distant memory. Immediate memory operates within the short duration of the present moment. It allows us to follow a conversation, understand a sentence, or experience a melody as a continuous pattern rather than isolated sounds. This immediate retention gives thickness to the present. Without it, even simple perception would break apart. A spoken sentence would collapse into meaningless syllables because each sound would vanish before the next appeared. The mind would never grasp continuity. Immediate memory therefore allows consciousness to hold several moments together simultaneously. But distant memory stretches far beyond this short span. It stores the events of earlier life, the experiences that shape the development of the self. Through distant memory, childhood remains psychologically alive within adulthood. Past relationships continue influencing present emotions. Early decisions echo through later choices. Time accumulates inside the mind. This accumulation creates the strange phenomenon of psychological duration. A person in their later years may feel that decades of life exist simultaneously within their awareness. The past is not gone. It exists as layers of remembered experience that can be re-entered at any moment. The present becomes a meeting point of many times. James saw that this structure explains why certain moments feel especially powerful. A present experience may resonate with deep memories, activating emotional echoes that stretch across years. A simple place may carry enormous significance because it connects the current moment with earlier chapters of life. The physical environment remains unchanged. The psychological meaning deepens because memory fills it with accumulated time. This phenomenon also explains the persistence of unresolved emotion. Experiences that were never fully processed remain alive within memory. They wait quietly until something in the present resembles the past strongly enough to awaken them again. A tone of voice, a gesture, a particular situation can suddenly release emotions that appear disproportionate to the present circumstances. The reaction belongs partly to another time. Memory bridges those times together. This can become both a source of suffering and a source of continuity. Traumatic memories may trap a person inside emotional patterns that repeat across years. Yet positive memories can also provide resilience. Recalling past courage strengthens present determination. Remembering earlier love deepens the meaning of current relationships. The past feeds the present with emotional substance. But memory does not only influence emotion, it sustains the narrative of identity. When a person says, "I have always been this kind of person," they are referring to a pattern discovered within remembered experiences. The mind scans its archive, selecting events that support the story it believes about itself. This narrative creates stability. Without it, identity would constantly dissolve. Each new experience would feel disconnected from the previous one. The individual would lose the sense of being the same person moving through time. James understood that memory therefore performs a philosophical function. It allows the self to extend beyond the present moment. The individual becomes a being with history, and history generates responsibility. Because if the past continues to live inside the present, then actions accumulate consequences that cannot be easily erased. Choices shape the memories that will later shape identity. Every decision becomes part of the psychological archive from which future meaning will be constructed. The present is therefore never isolated. It is constantly transforming into memory. This realization introduces a subtle tension inside human existence. On one hand, memory provides continuity and identity. On the other hand, it traps the mind inside patterns formed long ago. The past guides perception, expectation, and reaction in ways the individual may barely recognize. Freedom must therefore operate within a landscape shaped by memory. The will does not begin on empty ground. It begins within a field of accumulated experience. James believed that understanding this relationship between memory and present consciousness is essential for understanding the self. The mind moves through time, carrying its own history. Each moment is shaped by what has been lived before. Yet even memory cannot fully explain the intensity of human experience, because some moments strike the mind with such force that they bypass reflection entirely. The heart races before the thought appears. The body reacts before the mind understands. Emotion surges through the organism before consciousness has time to interpret what is happening. Emotion does not begin in the mind. Emotion begins in the body. Human beings often believe that feelings arise from thoughts. We imagine that the mind interprets a situation first, and only afterward the body reacts with fear, joy, anger, or sorrow. The sequence appears obvious. First we understand the event, then we feel. William James challenged this entire assumption. He proposed a radical inversion that shocked the psychology of his time. The body reacts first. The feeling appears later. To understand the depth of this claim, one must look directly at lived experience rather than philosophical tradition. Consider a sudden loud noise in a quiet room. Before a person has time to analyze the situation, the body already jumps. The muscles tighten. The heart rate increases. Breathing shifts. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. Only after these physical changes occur does the mind say the word fear. James argued that the feeling of fear is not the cause of the bodily reaction. It is the awareness of the bodily reaction. We do not tremble because we are afraid. We feel afraid because we notice that we are trembling. This claim stripped emotion of its mysterious aura and placed it directly within the physiological life of the organism. Emotion becomes the mind observing the body in motion. At first, this idea feels almost absurd. It seems to contradict ordinary intuition. Yet when examined carefully, it begins to reveal an uncomfortable clarity. Imagine encountering a dangerous animal in the wild. The body immediately activates survival mechanisms. Muscles prepare for flight. The stomach tightens. Vision sharpens. Blood shifts toward the limbs. If all these bodily reactions were removed, what would remain of fear? A pale intellectual recognition of danger, perhaps, but the overwhelming force of emotion would vanish. James believed that emotions are inseparable from the bodily expressions that accompany them. Anger is not merely the thought of injustice. It is the clenched jaw, the rising heat in the chest, the tightening of the hands. Sadness is not only the recognition of loss. It is the slowing of movement, the heaviness in the limbs, the trembling of the voice. Without these physical patterns, emotional life would be strangely hollow. The body gives emotion its substance. This insight transformed psychology because it shifted attention away from abstract mental categories and toward the living organism. Emotions are not detached mental events floating in consciousness. They are embodied processes unfolding across the nervous system. The brain interprets signals from the body and translates them into the language of feeling. The body moves. The mind names the movement. James pushed the idea even further. If emotions depend on bodily states, then altering the body can alter the emotional experience itself. Change the breathing pattern, and anxiety begins to loosen. Adjust posture, and confidence increases. Relax facial muscles, and the intensity of anger diminishes. The body does not merely express emotion, it participates in creating it. This principle explains a curious fact about human life. Sometimes the fastest way to shift a mood is not through intellectual reasoning, but through physical action. A walk outside can dissolve mental heaviness that hours of reflection could not touch. Laughter can interrupt a cycle of worry. Deep breathing can quiet the agitation of the mind. The organism resets itself through movement. James recognized that this connection between body and emotion also reveals the vulnerability of human experience. Because emotional life depends partly on bodily conditions, fatigue, illness, and physical stress can reshape psychological states in powerful ways. A tired mind becomes pessimistic more easily. A restless body invites irritability. A weakened nervous system amplifies anxiety. The emotional world is not separate from the biological world. They are two expressions of the same underlying processes. This understanding forces a difficult confrontation with human fragility. People often believe that their emotional responses reveal deep truths about reality. A moment of despair may feel like evidence that life itself is meaningless. A surge of anger may feel like proof that someone has committed an unforgivable offense. But James would warn that emotion is partly physiological. The body is speaking, and the body is not always a reliable philosopher. This does not mean emotions are illusions. They carry vital information about the organism's relationship to its environment. Fear alerts us to danger. Joy signals alignment with something meaningful. Grief reflects the depth of attachment. But emotions must be interpreted carefully. They are signals, not final judgments. James saw another profound implication inside this theory. If emotions arise from bodily reactions, then emotional life is deeply tied to action. The body prepares to move before the mind fully understands why. Fear prepares the organism to escape. Anger prepares it to confront. Love prepares it to approach and connect. Emotion is readiness for action. The body organizes itself toward a particular direction in the world. And this means that emotion plays a central role in human decision-making. Even the most rational choice is influenced by the subtle bodily signals accompanying different possibilities. A person may analyze two options intellectually, yet feel an unexplained tension when considering one of them. The body has already begun reacting. Emotion whispers guidance before the intellect completes its calculation. James did not view this as a flaw in human reasoning. He saw it as an essential part of psychological life. Pure logic alone cannot guide behavior because life presents too many variables for slow calculation. Emotion provides rapid orientation by translating complex environmental signals into immediate bodily responses. The organism senses before it explains. Yet, this system can also mislead. Because the body sometimes reacts to memories rather than present reality. A person who once experienced humiliation in public speaking may feel intense anxiety before giving a speech years later, even when no real threat exists. The body remembers the earlier danger and prepares for it again. The emotional response belongs to the past, but the body experiences it as present. James understood that this interplay between memory and bodily reaction explains many forms of psychological struggle. Anxiety disorders, phobias, and persistent emotional patterns often arise when the body continues responding to past events as if they were still happening. The organism cannot easily distinguish between remembered threat and immediate threat. Emotion, therefore, becomes a bridge between past and present. This bridge can either enrich life or trap the individual within old reactions. Yet the same mechanism also allows positive emotional habits to form. When the body repeatedly associates certain actions with joy, confidence, or calm, those physical states become easier to activate in the future. The nervous system learns emotional responses just as it learns behavioral habits. Over time, the body becomes trained toward particular moods. A person who practices calm breathing during stressful situations gradually teaches the body to remain steadier under pressure. A person who repeatedly engages in expressive anger may strengthen the bodily pathways that trigger rage. Emotion becomes conditioned through repetition. James saw that understanding this dynamic offers a powerful opportunity for transformation. Changing emotional life does not always require arguing with thoughts. Sometimes it requires altering the bodily patterns that feed those thoughts. Stand differently, breathe differently, move differently. The body begins to send new signals to the mind. The emotional landscape shifts. This insight dissolves the artificial boundary people often place between mind and body. Consciousness is not an isolated phenomenon floating inside the skull. It is the living expression of the entire organism interacting with the world. Thought, memory, emotion, sensation, and movement form a continuous system. James believed that psychology must treat the human being as this integrated whole, rather than as a purely intellectual machine. And when he examined how individuals navigate life within this system, another question emerged with unavoidable force. If emotions arise from bodily reactions and guide action through immediate signals, how can we determine whether our beliefs about the world are actually true? Feelings alone cannot guarantee truth. Intellectual theories alone cannot guarantee usefulness. Some beliefs inspire courage. Others produce paralysis. Some ideas help people live with greater vitality. Others collapse under the weight of real experience. James realized that philosophy itself must eventually answer a practical question, not merely whether an idea sounds convincing, but whether it works in the living reality of human life. Truth is not a decoration of thought. Truth is a test of life. Philosophy has often behaved like a distant spectator, observing the world from safe intellectual towers. It constructs elegant theories, refines definitions, and debates abstract concepts as if ideas exist independently of the human struggle to live. William James refused this distance. He demanded that philosophy return to the battlefield of experience, because an idea that cannot survive contact with life is not wisdom. It is ornament. James introduced a radical approach that later came to be known as pragmatism. The word itself sounds modest, almost technical, but behind it lies a brutal demand. An idea must prove its value through consequences. The meaning of any belief is found not in its logical beauty, but in what happens when people live by it. If a belief produces clarity, courage, cooperation, and effective action, then it carries truth within the context of human existence. If it produces paralysis, confusion, and despair, its claim to truth becomes questionable. This does not mean truth becomes arbitrary. It means truth must demonstrate its power in experience. James understood that many philosophical debates continue endlessly because they remain detached from practical consequences. Two thinkers argue about abstract metaphysical structures, while ordinary people continue living their lives without any change resulting from the argument. In such cases, the debate may be intellectually impressive, but existentially empty. Pragmatism cuts through this emptiness. It asks a single, ruthless question. What difference does this idea make in the way we live? If two theories produce identical consequences in experience, then arguing about which one is absolutely correct may be meaningless. The theories function the same within the reality of human life. But if adopting one belief transforms behavior, emotion, and social interaction in powerful ways, then the practical results become evidence of its value. James believed philosophy had forgotten this simple test. For centuries, thinkers searched for eternal truths detached from human concerns. They pursued absolute certainty, systems of thought so logically perfect that doubt would vanish forever. James saw this ambition as both noble and dangerous, because life rarely offers such certainty. Human beings must make decisions in conditions of incomplete information. We act without knowing all consequences. We choose directions without possessing final proof that the path is correct. Waiting for perfect certainty before acting would paralyze existence. Pragmatism, therefore, accepts a humbler but more realistic vision of truth. Truth grows through experience. Ideas begin as hypotheses, possibilities proposed by the mind. These hypotheses are then tested within the unpredictable conditions of life. Some beliefs prove fruitful. They guide successful action, resolve confusion, and open new possibilities. Others collapse when confronted with reality. Truth emerges through this process. It is not discovered once and frozen forever. It develops as human experience expands. James knew that critics would misunderstand this claim. Some would accuse pragmatism of reducing truth to mere convenience, as if people could simply decide that any comforting belief is true. But pragmatism does not celebrate illusion. Reality eventually exposes false beliefs. An idea that ignores the structure of the world will fail when tested repeatedly in experience. If someone believes gravity does not apply to them, the consequences will arrive quickly and without negotiation. Pragmatism, therefore, respects the resistance of reality. The world pushes back against false ideas. Truth survives because it works consistently within the constraints of the universe. But within those constraints, human interpretation still plays a role. Many questions cannot be answered by pure observation alone. Moral values, personal goals, political systems, and spiritual beliefs all involve judgments about how life should be lived. Here, pragmatism becomes especially powerful. Instead of searching endlessly for abstract moral certainty, it asks which values produce lives that human beings can genuinely flourish within, which ideals encourage cooperation rather than destruction. Which beliefs strengthen courage rather than deepen despair? Philosophy becomes a guide for living rather than a museum of arguments. James applied this approach to the problem that had haunted him since his early crisis: freedom. Determinism claimed that human choice is an illusion produced by physical laws. According to strict determinism, every action is the inevitable result of prior causes. The future unfolds mechanically from the past. James asked a pragmatic question: what happens to human life if people fully believe this theory? If individuals see themselves as powerless mechanisms, responsibility weakens. Moral effort fades. The motivation to struggle against injustice loses its force. People may begin to surrender their agency because they believe their actions cannot alter the inevitable. Now consider the alternative belief. Suppose individuals adopt the belief that their choices genuinely influence the course of events. Suppose they believe that effort matters, that decisions shape the future, that responsibility is real. What happens then? People act differently. They take initiative. They accept moral accountability. They attempt to improve themselves and their environment. The belief in freedom generates energy. From a pragmatic perspective, the second belief produces a richer and more constructive form of life. James did not claim this proves metaphysical freedom in the ultimate sense. Instead, he argued that believing in freedom opens possibilities that disbelief would close. The belief becomes justified through its consequences. This approach reshaped the relationship between philosophy and everyday existence. Ideas were no longer distant theories floating above reality. They became tools for navigating the complexity of life. Some tools function effectively. Others fail under pressure. Pragmatism evaluates ideas the same way a craftsman evaluates instruments. Do they work? Do they help us engage the world with greater clarity and capability? If they do, they deserve our respect. James believed this method also dissolves many unnecessary philosophical conflicts. Opposing theories may both contain useful insights, depending on the situations where they are applied. Instead of insisting on absolute victory, pragmatism examines which aspects of each theory function effectively in practice. Truth becomes plural rather than rigid. Different perspectives illuminate different aspects of reality. But pragmatism also carries a moral challenge because it forces individuals to accept responsibility for their beliefs. Ideas are not harmless mental decorations. They shape behavior, influence institutions, and direct the evolution of societies. A destructive belief can poison an entire culture. A life-affirming belief can inspire generations. The stakes of philosophy therefore extend far beyond academic debates. In the modern world surrounding 2025, this insight becomes even more urgent. Information spreads across the globe instantly. Ideas circulate through digital networks, influencing millions of minds within hours. Some of these ideas inspire cooperation, creativity, and courage. Others spread fear, resentment, and division. The pragmatic question becomes unavoidable. What kind of world do our beliefs produce? Do they expand human possibility or shrink it? James believed that the value of an idea must ultimately be measured by the kind of life it enables people to live. Philosophy must stand beside science, ethics, and psychology as a practical guide for navigating the complexity of existence. But even pragmatism encounters a final boundary. There are moments when life demands belief before evidence appears. Situations where waiting for proof means losing the opportunity entirely. Human relationships, moral commitments, and spiritual convictions often belong to this category. At these moments, the individual faces a choice that cannot be solved through detached reasoning alone. The mind must decide whether to believe first. Beliefs sometimes arise before proof, and without that courage, entire dimensions of human life would remain forever closed. Philosophy often teaches caution, wait for evidence, examine every argument, demand certainty before commitment. This attitude protects the mind from illusion. It guards reason against deception. But life does not always grant the luxury of waiting. William James understood that human existence contains moments where evidence cannot appear until belief moves first. These moments form what he called genuine options, choices that are living, forced, and momentous, choices that cannot be postponed without losing their possibility. In such moments, refusing to believe is itself a decision, and often it is the decision that closes the door forever. James confronted this problem directly in what would become one of his most controversial philosophical arguments, the will to believe. The phrase itself unsettled many thinkers because it seemed to challenge the authority of reason. But James was not rejecting rational thought. He was exposing its limits. Reason operates by weighing evidence. It compares probabilities, examines causes, and evaluates arguments. In many areas of life, this method works brilliantly. Science advances through this disciplined patience. Knowledge grows because thinkers refuse to accept claims without sufficient proof. Yet certain decisions cannot wait for such proof. Consider the simplest example of human trust. Two people stand at the beginning of a relationship. Each wonders whether the other can be trusted. Evidence at this early stage remains incomplete. No experiment can guarantee loyalty. No logical argument can prove the sincerity of another heart. And yet, the relationship cannot begin without belief. If both individuals insist on perfect proof before extending trust, the connection never forms. Suspicion suffocates possibility before it can breathe. Belief must act first. Only after trust is offered does evidence begin to accumulate. Loyalty reveals itself through shared experience. Commitment grows through time. The original belief becomes justified because it created the conditions where its truth could appear. James saw that many of the most important aspects of human life operate in this way. Moral courage functions similarly. A person who waits for absolute certainty that justice will succeed may never resist injustice at all. The risks appear too large. The outcome remains uncertain. History offers many examples where courageous action seemed hopeless at the moment it occurred. Yet without that initial belief in the possibility of change, no transformation would ever begin. The individual must act as if the future can be shaped. Evidence arrives later. The same structure appears in personal identity. When someone attempts to change their life, evidence of success rarely appears immediately. A person struggling with despair cannot first prove that hope will work before choosing to hope. The decision must precede the confirmation. James argued that these situations expose a hidden dimension of human freedom. Belief itself can influence reality, not through magical thinking, but through practical consequences. A belief alters behavior. Behavior alters circumstances. Circumstances generate new evidence that either strengthens or weakens the original belief. Reality and belief interact in a continuous loop. Refusing to believe prematurely can interrupt that loop before it begins. James therefore insisted that the demand for absolute proof in every domain of life becomes a form of intellectual cowardice. It disguises fear as rational discipline. The skeptic claims to be protecting truth while quietly avoiding commitment. But the price of this caution can be enormous. A person who refuses belief may avoid certain illusions, yet they may also lose access to experiences that require trust, courage, and commitment to exist at all. Life contains opportunities that appear only to those willing to step forward without guarantees. This insight does not license blind faith. James carefully distinguished between genuine options and trivial ones. Belief should not be forced upon situations where evidence can easily be obtained. If a person wants to know whether a bridge is structurally sound, investigation should come before crossing. But when evidence cannot appear without prior belief, hesitation becomes destructive. The individual must decide. And that decision reveals the existential nature of belief. Belief is not merely an intellectual conclusion. It is a commitment of the will. The will to believe emerges when the human mind recognizes that neutrality is impossible. Standing still is itself a choice. Refusing to decide shapes reality just as much as deciding. James saw that modern intellectual culture often celebrates skepticism as the highest virtue. Doubt appears sophisticated. Commitment appears naive. The cautious observer feels superior to the believer who risks error. Yet this attitude quietly drains life of initiative. A society that worships skepticism above all else gradually loses the courage required to attempt new futures. Every possibility becomes suspect. Every vision appears uncertain. People retreat into passive observation rather than creative participation. The will to believe restores balance. It reminds human beings that action sometimes requires faith before verification. The explorer sails before the map is complete. The reformer speaks before public opinion has shifted. The lover commits before guarantees exist. Belief becomes the engine of possibility. James recognized that this principle also extends into the spiritual dimension of human existence. Questions about ultimate meaning, purpose, and transcendence rarely submit to laboratory verification. Scientific methods illuminate many aspects of reality, but they cannot exhaust the mystery of existence. Some individuals encounter moments where spiritual belief becomes a genuine option. Evidence neither compels belief nor decisively refutes it. The decision remains open. James argued that in such cases, the individual possesses the right to believe if that belief enriches life and inspires moral action. The risk of error cannot be eliminated, but the refusal to believe may close the door on experiences of meaning that could otherwise unfold. Again, the decision must come first. Evidence may follow. This philosophy does not eliminate uncertainty. It accepts uncertainty as a permanent feature of human life. The world does not present itself as a finished system where every answer is available. Instead, it offers possibilities that require participation. Human beings help shape the reality they inhabit through the beliefs they choose to live by. James therefore placed enormous responsibility upon the individual. Beliefs are not private decorations of the mind. They are forces that influence behavior, institutions, and cultural development. The ideas people choose to trust ripple outward into the structures of society. A belief in dignity encourages compassion. A belief in hopelessness breeds resignation. A belief in shared humanity inspires cooperation. History itself bends under the weight of collective belief. In the era surrounding 2025, this truth becomes impossible to ignore. Humanity stands at a moment where technological power expands rapidly while moral clarity struggles to keep pace. Information floods consciousness from every direction. Certainty appears increasingly fragile. The temptation towards cynical skepticism grows stronger. Yet, James would ask a sharper question. What kind of future emerges from this belief? If humanity abandons belief in responsibility, freedom, and shared purpose, the consequences may become self-fulfilling. Despair generates the world it expects to see, but belief can generate its own momentum. When individuals act as if meaning exists, they begin creating structures that embody that meaning. Communities form around shared values. Institutions emerge to protect dignity. Creative efforts transform imagination into reality. Belief becomes a catalyst. The will to believe, therefore, marks the final turning point in James's philosophical journey. After exploring consciousness, identity, habit, memory, emotion, and truth, he arrives at a simple but demanding insight. Human life is not a finished equation waiting to be solved. It is an unfinished experiment. Each person participates in shaping the outcome through the beliefs they dare to live by. The mind does not merely observe reality, it engages with it, influencing its direction through action, attention, and commitment. And once this realization appears, another question rises quietly beneath it. If belief, experience, and action together shape the meaning of life, then philosophy can no longer remain confined to abstract speculation. It must step fully into the arena of human living, where every thought eventually becomes a choice about how existence itself will be lived. Philosophy is not born from comfort. It is born from crisis. Human beings rarely begin questioning the meaning of life when everything feels stable. The search begins when certainty cracks, when familiar beliefs collapse, when the mind realizes that science can explain many mechanisms of the universe, yet still leaves the deepest question unanswered. Why live? William James stood inside this fracture. At a time when scientific determinism threatened to reduce human beings to mechanical processes, he refused to surrender the possibility of freedom, responsibility, and meaning. His philosophy did not begin with abstract speculation. It began with a psychological struggle that demanded an answer strong enough to sustain life itself. From that crisis emerged a vision of human existence that remains unsettlingly relevant. Consciousness is not a collection of static fragments, but a living stream in constant motion. Thought flows. Meaning emerges from the margins of awareness before it becomes clear in the center. Attention selects what becomes real in experience, quietly shaping the world each person inhabits. The self is not a single unchanging core, but a layered structure composed of bodily presence, social identity, and inner reflection. These layers interact, conflict, and negotiate, forming the fragile unity we call personal identity. Habit reveals that character is not built through grand declarations, but through repeated actions so small they often escape notice. The nervous system learns from repetition. Over time, the smallest behaviors carve pathways that eventually shape destiny. Memory stretches the present across time, allowing past experience to live within current awareness. The self becomes a continuity rather than a moment. The past breathes inside the present and quietly influences the future. Emotion exposes the deep unity between mind and body. Feelings do not float in abstract thought. They emerge from bodily reactions, from the living organism responding to its environment before the intellect has time to interpret. Pragmatism, then, returns philosophy to its ultimate test. Ideas must prove themselves in life. Truth is not merely logical consistency, but the capacity of a belief to guide human beings through the unpredictable terrain of existence. And finally, the will to believe confronts the unavoidable uncertainty of life. Some choices must be made before evidence appears. Waiting for perfect proof may destroy the possibility of the experience itself. Belief becomes an act of courage rather than a passive conclusion. Across all these insights runs a single thread. Philosophy is not an intellectual ornament. It is a way of living. James refused the illusion that thought exists separately from action. Beliefs shape behavior. Behavior shapes the world. Ideas, therefore, carry moral weight because they influence the direction of human life. This insight becomes especially urgent in the modern era approaching 2025. Human knowledge expands rapidly. Technology accelerates communication, and information floods consciousness from every direction. Yet, the central existential questions remain unchanged. What should we believe? How should we live? What makes a human life meaningful? Science can describe the mechanisms of the brain, the structure of matter, and the laws governing the universe. But the decision about how to live within that universe remains a philosophical question. James offered no final formula. Instead, he revealed a responsibility. Human beings participate in the creation of meaning through the beliefs they choose to live by. Freedom is not guaranteed by metaphysics alone. It becomes real when individuals act as if their choices matter. Meaning does not descend from outside existence like a finished answer. It emerges through attention, action, memory, emotion, habit, and belief, working together inside the unfolding experiment of human life. Philosophy, therefore, returns to its original purpose, not to escape the world, but to help human beings face it with open eyes. And the moment a person accepts that responsibility, something shifts quietly inside consciousness. Life no longer appears as a predetermined script waiting to unfold. It becomes a field of possibilities, a place where belief, experience, and action continuously shape one another. A place where meaning does not simply exist, it must be lived.